What if I told you that the world's most heavily fortified border is about to become a war zone, not against migrants, but against an enemy that's already conquered territory, commands armies larger than most nations' militaries, and generates more revenue than Netflix and Starbucks combined? We're watching something unprecedented unfold along the Rio Grande. The Pentagon is quietly repositioning assets, special operations units are being briefed, and Mexico's new president is facing a choice that could reshape North American security for generations. But here's what nobody's telling you: this isn't actually about drugs anymore. The cartels have evolved into something far more dangerous: parallel governments with sophisticated intelligence networks, military-grade weaponry, and the ability to destabilize entire regions. They control ports, infiltrate institutions, and operate with a level of impunity that would make some nation-states envious. The question isn't whether American forces will expand their presence. That's already happening. The real question is whether we're witnessing the prelude to a conflict that will redefine sovereignty itself, where the traditional rules of war don't apply and where the enemy doesn't wear a uniform or represent a flag. This is the story they're not broadcasting on the evening news. Let me be very direct with you about what's happening right now, because the mainstream narrative is missing the forest for the trees. We've been conditioned to think about the situation at the southern border in very simplistic terms: immigration, drugs, border security. But what's actually unfolding is something far more complex and frankly more alarming than anything we've seen in the Western Hemisphere in our lifetimes. The cartels operating in Mexico today are not the same organizations they were even a decade ago. They've transformed into something that defies our traditional categories of organized crime, terrorism, or insurgency. They're all of these things and none of these things simultaneously. Think about this for a moment. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as CJNG, operates in all 32 Mexican states and has a presence in more than 50 countries worldwide. Their annual revenue estimates range anywhere from $20 to $30 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the GDP of some nations. They don't just traffic drugs, they control supply chains, operate sophisticated money laundering networks that would impress Wall Street analysts, and maintain intelligence gathering capabilities that rival some government agencies. They've recruited former Special Forces soldiers, not just from Mexico, but from Guatemala, Colombia, and other nations with elite military training programs. These aren't street thugs anymore. These are highly organized, well-funded, technologically sophisticated entities that control territory and populations. And here's where it gets really interesting from a geopolitical standpoint. The United States government has been dancing around the question of designating these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations for years now. Why? Because the implications of such a designation would be profound. If the cartels are terrorist organizations, then the gloves come off in terms of what the US military can legally do. It opens the door to direct military intervention on Mexican soil, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. But more importantly, it acknowledges a truth that many policymakers are uncomfortable admitting: that Mexico is facing an insurgency, a genuine threat to state sovereignty, and that this insurgency is happening right on America's doorstep. The expansion of US military presence that we're seeing isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a broader recognition that the security situation in Mexico has deteriorated to a point where it poses a direct national security threat to the United States. We're not just talking about drugs flowing north anymore. We're talking about the potential collapse of governance in key regions of Mexico, the possibility of failed state dynamics emerging in areas that are geographically closer to Texas than some parts of California are to each other. This is asymmetric warfare playing out in slow motion, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. Let me walk you through what the cartel evolution actually looks like on the ground, because understanding this is crucial to grasping why the military response is escalating. In the 1980s and 1990s, cartels were primarily trafficking organizations. They moved product, they had enforcers, they bribed officials, but they operated largely in the shadows. Their goal was to stay invisible, to keep the money flowing without attracting too much heat. That business model is dead. Today's cartels control territory openly. They collect taxes from businesses. They run parallel judicial systems where they settle disputes and enforce their version of law. In some regions of Mexico, if you have a problem, you don't go to the police. You go to the cartel because they're the only ones with the power to actually resolve issues. This represents a fundamental challenge to the concept of the state's monopoly on violence, which is the bedrock of modern governance. When non-state actors can provide security, enforce contracts, and administer justice more effectively than the government, you don't have a crime problem anymore, you have a sovereignty problem. And this is exactly what's happening in states like Michoacan, Guerrero, parts of Sinaloa, and increasingly in areas closer to the US border. The Mexican government controls the cities during the day, maybe, but vast rural areas and even some urban neighborhoods are effectively under cartel governance. Now, Mexico's current administration has been trying to navigate this nightmare with a strategy they call abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. The idea was to address the root causes of cartel power through social programs, poverty alleviation, and reducing the confrontational approach that previous administrations took. And look, there's logic to this. The drug war approach of the Calderon years led to catastrophic violence, over 100,000 dead, mass disappearances, entire communities traumatized. So the instinct to try something different is understandable. But here's the brutal reality. The cartels interpreted this approach as weakness. Violence hasn't decreased. It's become more targeted, more strategic. The cartels have consolidated power, not retreated from it. And this brings us to the American military expansion. What we're seeing is a multi-layered approach that's being implemented quietly, without the fanfare of a formal declaration or major policy announcement. First, there's the increased presence of National Guard troops at the border, but that's actually the most visible and least significant part of the story. What matters more is the intelligence cooperation, the joint task forces, the positioning of assets that can respond rapidly to cross-border threats. The Pentagon has been conducting threat assessments that treat cartel activity through the lens of hybrid warfare, a combination of criminal enterprise, insurgency, and state-level threat. Special operations forces have been training with Mexican military units for years, but the nature of that training has shifted. It's no longer just counter-narcotics, it's counter-insurgency, intelligence gathering, targeting high-value individuals in complex operational environments. The US has deployed surveillance assets, drones, satellites, signals intelligence capabilities that are monitoring cartel communications and movements in real time. This intelligence is being shared with vetted Mexican units, and I emphasize vetted because cartel infiltration of Mexican security forces is a massive problem. You can't share sensitive intelligence with a military or police force when there's a significant chance that information will end up in cartel hands within hours. There's also been a significant increase in interagency cooperation on the American side. The DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, the military, all of these entities are coordinating in ways they weren't before. Financial intelligence is being used to track money flows, identify cartel financial networks, and disrupt their economic infrastructure. Because here's something most people don't realize. You can kill or capture all the cartel leaders you want, but if the financial networks remain intact, new leaders will emerge immediately. The cartels have succession plans, distributed command structures, and enough money to recruit and train replacements indefinitely. But let's talk about what this looks like from Mexico's perspective, because this is where the geopolitical tension really emerges. Mexican sovereignty is a deeply sensitive issue rooted in a history of American intervention and territorial loss. The idea of US military forces operating on Mexican soil, even in an advisory or support capacity, triggers profound historical anxieties. Every Mexican schoolchild learns about the Mexican-American War, the loss of half their territory, the various American interventions in the early 20th century. So when American politicians start talking about designating cartels as terrorists or suggest military operations against them, it's not just a policy debate in Mexico, it's an existential question about national dignity and independence. The Mexican government is caught in an impossible position. They need American support, the intelligence, the training, the resources, to have any chance of confronting the cartels effectively. But they cannot be seen as allowing American military forces to operate freely in Mexico without triggering a political crisis that could destabilize the government itself. This is why so much of the cooperation happens quietly, why official statements often contradict what's actually happening on the ground, why both governments engage in careful diplomatic choreography around these issues. And here's where the situation gets even more complicated. The cartels themselves are not static entities. They're constantly evolving, adapting to pressure, finding new revenue streams, exploiting new opportunities. Fentanyl trafficking has been a game changer for them. Unlike cocaine or heroin, which require agricultural inputs and complex supply chains, fentanyl can be synthesized from precursor chemicals imported from China, manufactured in relatively small labs, and produces profit margins that dwarf traditional drugs. A kilogram of fentanyl has vastly more street value than a kilogram of cocaine, and it's easier to smuggle because you need smaller quantities to meet demand. This has made the cartels even more dangerous and unpredictable. The violence associated with fentanyl trafficking is different, more brutal, more public, designed to send messages. Mass killings, displays of bodies, attacks on civilians, all of this serves a purpose in the cartel playbook. It's about territorial control, it's about intimidating rivals and government forces, and it's about demonstrating power. The cartels have learned that spectacular violence attracts media attention, which can sometimes work in their favor by making them seem more powerful and omnipresent than they actually are. But there's another dimension to this that we need to examine, and it relates to global power structures and how they're shifting. The cartel problem in Mexico is not isolated from broader geopolitical trends. China's role in supplying precursor chemicals for fentanyl production is well documented. Chinese companies, operating with what appears to be at minimum regulatory indifference from Beijing, sell these chemicals to Mexican cartels. Now, is this a deliberate strategy by the Chinese government to destabilize the United States by flooding it with deadly drugs? Or is it simply a case of profit-seeking companies exploiting regulatory loopholes? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the effect is the same, a massive public health crisis in the United States that claims tens of thousands of lives every year. This connects to larger questions about economic warfare, hybrid threats, and the ways in which traditional concepts of conflict have become obsolete. We're living in an era where a non-state actor with enough money and weapons can challenge government authority, where chemical suppliers on one side of the world can contribute to a death toll on the other side without ever firing a shot, where the distinction between crime and warfare has become meaningless. The cartels are exploiting the gaps in our international system, the boundaries between nations, the limitations of law enforcement cooperation, the jurisdictional challenges that prevent effective responses, and the United States is responding by militarizing the approach, which brings its own set of risks and complications. Military solutions to what are fundamentally political and economic problems rarely work out the way planners expect. We've seen this in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in countless other interventions where superior firepower and technology couldn't overcome the fundamental dynamics driving conflict. The cartels exist because there's enormous demand for drugs in the United States and because there's crushing poverty and lack of opportunity in many parts of Mexico. Military force can disrupt organizations, kill leaders, seize territory temporarily, but it can't address those underlying conditions. Yet at the same time, the situation has deteriorated to a point where some kind of forceful response seems unavoidable. When cartels are operating with impunity, when they're killing journalists and politicians, when they're displacing entire communities and creating refugee flows, when they're poisoning American citizens with fentanyl, the pressure to do something, anything, becomes overwhelming. This is the dilemma facing both governments. The recognition that military force alone won't solve the problem, combined with the reality that the problem has grown beyond what traditional law enforcement can handle. The expansion of U.S. military presence is also happening against the backdrop of broader changes in American strategic priorities. For decades, U.S. security policy was focused on the Middle East, on terrorism, on great power competition with Russia and China. But there's been a growing recognition that the most immediate threat to American security might actually be right across the southern border. The number of American deaths from fentanyl overdoses exceeds the number of Americans killed in car accidents in many recent years. That's a staggering statistic. It means that the cartels are killing more Americans than almost any other single cause of preventable death. This has shifted political calculations. Republicans and Democrats might disagree on immigration policy, but there's increasing bipartisan support for taking a harder line on cartels. The question is what that harder line actually looks like in practice. Does it mean more troops at the border? Does it mean covert operations targeting cartel leadership? Does it mean economic sanctions against individuals and entities involved in drug trafficking? Does it mean working with the Mexican military to conduct joint operations? All of these options are being discussed, and some are already being implemented to varying degrees. What we're witnessing is the opening phase of what could become a protracted conflict that doesn't fit neatly into our traditional categories of war. It's not a conventional war between nation-states. It's not purely a law enforcement matter. It's something hybrid, something that requires a response that combines elements of military force, intelligence operations, economic warfare, diplomatic pressure, and yes, addressing the demand side of the drug trade and the underlying socioeconomic conditions that make cartel recruitment possible. Whether the United States and Mexico have the political will and strategic vision to pursue such a comprehensive approach remains to be seen. What's clear is that the old playbook isn't working and the situation is getting worse, not better, which is why we're seeing this military expansion happening now.